Welcome to today's presentation on a probabilistic approach to production forecasting. In this presentation, I will discuss some of the limitations with traditional decline curve analysis and deterministic modeling, which can be solved by applying this probabilistic approach. I will then describe the approach itself and apply it to a couple of field examples so you can see how it is used in practice. The reliable early evaluation of tight fractured reservoirs is very difficult. Often we see a prolonged transient rate pressure response. We don't see boundary-dominated flow, and we're not quite sure when we're going to hit those boundaries and what the size of our reservoir is. That makes it very difficult to predict how much we can recover from this reservoir. Completions are very complex, and they leave us with a reservoir with very many unknown parameters. EUR estimates for these wells are arguably best obtained from model-based production forecasts. An RTA probabilistic model-based approach is proposed. In this, we will investigate an acceptable parameter space and provide probability distributions for both forecast and EUR. This approach is demonstrated with field examples. So what is the problem with traditional decline curve analysis? In this particular example, we have best fit a decline through some initial production, about a year and a half of it. This best fit yielded a B-value of 2, which is consistent with transient flow. So what's the problem? Well, we are creating a 20-year forecast, and in this forecast, we've assumed that transient flow will persist for 20 years. Is that reasonable? Maybe, but that could also be very, very optimistic. In order to combat some of this optimism, engineers have been applying D-limbs to their decline curves, meaning at a certain decline rate, let's say 10% for example, the B-value will be modified from 2 to a lower value, maybe 1 or maybe less. This is a means of reducing the optimism of the forecast, but it is purely empirical, and it doesn't leave me with a bunch of confidence in that forecast. Here's another illustration of some issues with just using decline curve analysis. Here is the production history for both well 1 and well 2. They have somewhat similar histories, and when I best fit a decline through them, they both yield a B-value of 1, and their EURs are fairly similar, between 620 and 630,000 barrels. But if I have more information on these wells, how can I apply it? For example, if I know the well spacing of each well, well 1 is spaced at 1,200 feet, whereas well 2, its neighboring well is only 800 feet away. So I would expect in the long term that well 1 would actually recover more. What if I also knew the flowing pressures of these wells? So well 1 is still flowing at 1,500 psi, whereas well 2 only has 500 psi left in the tank. Lastly, RTA can yield the volume of our contacted SRV. If I know that well 1 has stimulated about 500,000 barrels versus only 200,000 barrels for well 2, do I still expect the same EUR for these wells? Just using decline curve analysis doesn't allow me to use all of the information available to me. Now that everyone's convinced that we need to use rate transient analysis, I want to quickly touch on some of the issues with deterministic modeling. Seeking an optimum model history match for a multi-stage fractured horizontal well cannot give us a single unique solution. anyone who has history matched one of these wells knows that there are an infinite number of history matches that can match that data. Therefore, deterministic results don't reflect the potential range of uncertainty in our reservoir and forecast parameters. Are we really sure that XF is 100 feet or 500 feet? Or could it be anywhere in between, or even smaller or larger? What about net pay? Is it 150 feet, 300 feet? Maybe it's 227 feet. These same challenges apply to all reservoir types. All analytical models are non-unique. To further illustrate this point, I'm going to tell a little story about Jack, Jill, and John. They're all reservoir engineers that just want to forecast a well to the best of their abilities. I'm going to walk you through how each of them went about doing it, and hopefully this will really illustrate the issue with deterministic modeling. So Jack is going to apply the URM analysis in order to gain a better understanding of what his reservoir looks like. Now, we don't need to go into the details of the URM analysis, but essentially, we're looking at a square root time plot along with a flowing material balance plot in order to get an idea of what is the size of our stimulated reservoir volume. In this case, Jack's workflow yields 91 feet of fracture half-length. Jack then creates a history match. XF is 91 feet. You can see some of the other relevant fracture parameters listed on the left, and that's a great match. So Jack's feeling pretty good. Now, Jill has approached this problem slightly differently. She's used our compound linear type curve to generate an estimate of fracture half-length. This looks like a pretty good type curve match. XF coming from this type curve match is 239 feet. Jill creates an analytical model. XF 239 feet. You can see the other parameters. The height is 76 feet. You can see the permeabilities, the inner zone permeability, 1.35 microdarcies, outer zone permeability, 250 nanodarcies, and the distance between the fracture and the outer permeability boundary is 40 feet. Jill also has a great match. So Jill's feeling pretty good about herself. Jack creates a forecast because ultimately people want to know how much this well is going to produce. 250,000 barrels. Jill creates a forecast. 247,000 barrels. Pretty much the same forecast. Both Jill and Jack have independently analyzed this well, and both forecasts suggest about 250,000 barrels. So everything's lining up pretty nicely until John shows up. Now, John is quite confident that the fracture half-length is 200 feet and the fracture height is 175 feet. You can see that his history match, with lower permeabilities, looks pretty much the same as Jack and Jill's. But what forecast does he get? 540,000 barrels. More than twice as much as both Jack and Jill. So, who's correct? We have different forecasts, identical history matches, all could be argued are good matches. But who's right? And once we decide who's right, how do we decide what our P50 is? In each of these reservoir engineers' minds, they have come up with a P50, their best estimate. But they're different. So which one is the P50? And once we decide that, if we can even decide that objectively, how do we then go about generating P10s and P90s? Deterministic modeling can also be very subjective. This is where the probabilistic approach is going to help us. The probabilistic approach is going to generate, using Monte Carlo simulation, defensible P90, P50, and P10 forecasts. So what is the probabilistic approach? Well, uncertainty in our production forecasting will actually be quantified using this approach, which will generate output through numerous analytical model-based forecasting results. Using Monte Carlo simulation, a systematic investigation of an allowable parameter space will be adequately and efficiently sampled. What is Monte Carlo simulation? For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, I will just show a quick example here. Let's just take the volumetric equation. A very simple equation, but instead of just solving it by plugging in our area, our net pay, our porosity, and our saturation, and doing the multiplication, we're going to do this about 1,000 times, or 1,000,000 times, or 100 times. Each of these inputs will have a distribution. So instead of saying, I know the area is 160 acres, I'm going to say the area could be anywhere between 80 acres and 240 acres, and it's most likely 200 acres, for example. I repeat this for all of my uncertain inputs, and then I have distributions for all my uncertain parameters. I sample these distributions multiple times, run the calculation, and generate hundreds and hundreds of original oil in place values. This gives me a distribution of original oil in place. So I now know my P90 original oil in place, my P50, and my P10. Now this is a simple volumetric example. When we apply this in this approach, it'll actually be the analytical model equation as our engine for generating results. So much more complicated, but the same theory of Monte Carlo simulation applies. Uncertain inputs, Monte Carlo simulation generates our probabilistic output. So distributions are specified to capture the uncertainty for specific input parameters, while others are used in regression analysis to obtain the best history match of the data. This is a key bullet that I would like to reiterate. In the last example, our simple volumetric example, we assign distributions to each input. The main difference between that simple Monte Carlo simulation and this approach is that now we have production history. If we randomly sampled our uncertain distributions, we would be left with a random model which didn't match our data. The one difference in this probabilistic approach is we need to choose input parameters to be used in regression analysis so that each and every run matches the data. Choosing the input distributions for these uncertain parameters requires practical and sound engineering judgment. Correlations between input parameters can also be specified. The goodness of fit in each run is tracked and compared against the baseline. By doing this, we can discard poor history matches so they are not included in our results. This process is relatively quick and automated, and it is akin to an engineer repetitively history matching the same data set with hundreds of different input parameters. The output of this process is probabilistic production forecasts, which are calculated using the raw forecasts from every satisfactory run. So just to summarize, what has this probabilistic approach accomplished for us? Well, it has taken the uncertain distributions we've assigned to input parameters, randomly sampled them, created hundreds and hundreds of history matches, independent, unique history matches that all match our production history to our satisfaction, and it has forecasted all of these reservoir configurations. From those hundreds and hundreds of forecasts, we have calculated the P90, P50, and P10. Here's what that output looks like. So instead of having just one forecast, which we have to subjectively decide, is this our P50 or our P90 or what have you, or instead of having Jack and Jill's forecast versus John's forecast, we now have a range of all of the possible forecasts given a certain set of inputs. What assumptions go into this approach? Well, we are assuming that future well performance can be fully described within the context of the chosen analytical model. Potential future operational issues are not considered. Results are from analytical model output. Therefore, the equations are based on constant effective permeability in the reservoir. And since we do not consider multi-phase flow or solution gas drive, EURs will be on the conservative side. So what are some of the benefits to this approach? Well, we're considering our changing flowing pressures. We're getting more knowledge about our reservoir characteristics as our solution is based on the physics of fluid flow. We're using all the information available to us to produce our best possible forecast. We're not only recognizing, but we're also quantifying the uncertainty, and this provides forecasts at specific probabilities. But what are the drawbacks? Well, it's more complicated, and it certainly takes more time and expertise than empirical methods. This approach is also not yet well recognized by regulators. However, it is becoming more and more common in the industry. What are some of the advantages of analytical models? Well, they provide immediate feedback to the analyst. They also allow us to use regression analysis. This is essential in history matching each run. They are practical as they're much faster than numerical models, and they can be used to generate probabilistic EUR outputs. Practically speaking, this isn't possible with numerical models. It would be much too time-consuming to couple a Monte Carlo simulation with a numerical model. Some of the advantages of probabilistic modeling: systematically investigating numerous potential reservoir configurations. We don't know enough to describe the exact reservoir down there, but we have ranges for each of our inputs, so the Monte Carlo simulation allows us to evaluate all the potential configurations within those ranges. We're accounting for the uncertainty in our inputs. We're providing a range of potential recoveries as opposed to just one number. There's a confidence level associated with each forecast. This reduces the bias between reservoir engineers. Given the same set of inputs, reservoir engineers should come out with similar results using this probabilistic approach. We can also analyze the raw simulation data after the simulation to expose correlations between input parameters. Which input is driving our EUR? By analyzing the simulation data, we can also improve on the accuracy of our high-impact parameters, ignoring inputs that are less relevant. We can also verify that parameters used in regression analysis have regressed to realistic distributions. all of this information can be used to enhance operations and completions methodologies. Now we're going to apply this approach to two field examples, one in the Bakken and one in the Kharir basement. So we'll start with the Bakken, which is in the Williston Basin, and you can see here it stretches across most of North Dakota, a little bit in Saskatchewan, Montana, and South Dakota. What are the basic data requirements for RTA? Well, completions information. So what is the completion type? In the case of horizontal multi-fractured wells, how many stages, how many clusters, what type of proppant, frac fluid, fluid analysis, PVT if available, and petrophysicals, so interpreted logs to get estimates of net pay, porosity, saturations. Daily production volumes with either wellhead or bottom hole pressure data are required. If we're working with wellhead pressure data, we also require wellbore schematics, so deviation survey along with all the different wellbore configurations in order to convert those wellhead pressures to bottom hole pressures. Any additional considerations are helpful as well. Dates of fracture stimulations on offset wells, any refracs that may have been performed. All kinds of data can be helpful. For this example, we forecasted for 50 years. You can see the abandonment rates we used, 5 barrels per day for oil, and we ran a minimum of 500 runs. Unless otherwise known, all distributions specified were either triangular or uniform, and our inner zone permeability, K1, along with our matrix permeability, K2, and our fracture conductivity were used as regression parameters. This means that while other reservoir parameters that I'll go through later are being assigned distributions, these three parameters are being used to regress to match the history for each run. The trilinear flow composite model will be the engine for our Monte Carlo simulation. This model was developed by OSCAN, and it assumes a homogeneous completion. So it assumes that we have toe-to-heel stimulation all along the wellbore. The white area there is our stimulated reservoir volume, and the permeability of that region in this diagram is described as our KSRV and is also referred to as K1 in our model. The green area is unstimulated rock. That is where we'll get our second linear flow, and that is described as Km or K matrix, and in our model it is referred to as K2. So here was our first analytical model. This is one possible description of this well, and I don't want you to get too hung up on the actual values being used here. The point is, I got a nice history match, but this is one possible history match. From this history match, I created a forecast, and once again, this is one possible forecast. Is this my P50? If so, what is my P90? What is my P10? What are some of the possible outcomes from this well? I know it's not a guarantee that this forecast is going to play out like this. So the first step is to assign distributions to uncertain parameters. The Monte Carlo simulation will then sample these distributions, and it'll output probabilistic forecasts. The first parameter we have here is fracture half-length. I've assigned a triangular distribution with a minimum of 50 feet and a maximum of 500 feet. Ideally, use of microseismic or tracer data or any information or intel from your completions engineer can help describe this distribution. In the absence of this information, we need to use our best engineering judgment to come up with these distributions. For this example, I also specified the drainage area as an uncertain parameter. In this case, the well is a leasehold well and has no infill wells drilled around it. So by specifying a distribution between 1,500 feet and 4,500 feet, I'm basically saying I don't know what our infill well program will look like yet. If I know that we will be coming in and drilling at 2,000 feet, then I would likely set this distribution to constant and not have it randomly sampled. For the number of fractures, this particular completion was a ball drop completion. So best case scenario, we're getting one active fracture for each stage. The way I've modeled this distribution was using a triangular distribution. I said we're most likely to get each stage successful, but there is a risk of stages standing out. So worst case scenario, we'll have 3 stages sanded out and only 9 active fractures. So you can build distributions according to what you think is going on downhole, and ideally with input from completions engineers, drilling engineers, whomever it may be. Now here we have our matrix permeability, our K2. In this particular example, I didn't actually specify a distribution. I have set it to regression analysis. But in certain cases, if we have lots of data available to us, DFITs, core analysis, maybe radial flow analysis from older vertical wells, K2 could be specified as an input distribution as well. For all of the petrophysical properties, I have specified distributions, and ideally these distributions would come from a petrophysicist who has looked at the logs and has a good idea of the uncertainty in net pay, porosity, fluid saturation. Once all of these distributions are specified, we are ready to run the simulation. And once the simulation is finished, we have our probabilistic model results. So similar to that picture we had before, we now have a range of EURs. We have a range of volume in place. All of our parameters now have a distribution associated with them. You can see that the cumulative oil, we now have a P90 of about 280,000 barrels and a P10 of about 568,000 barrels. This is the final result of our work. Instead of having just one solution, we've described the range of solutions. We can now use this as context if we need to choose one number. We now have more information available to us to choose this number. If I want to choose a conservative number, I can tell my manager this well is going to produce 280,000 barrels, and I'm 90% sure of that. Similarly, if I'm feeling a little aggressive, I can tell him, well, this well could produce 567,000 barrels. But deep down, I know that there's a 10% chance of that happening. As a last step, we can also fit some decline parameters to our P50, for example, to get DIs, B values, D limbs. This is ultimately the language that everybody speaks in the industry. It's a common language, so it doesn't hurt to back this out and express our forecast in terms of a common language. Lastly, this is the post-simulation analysis. We can use a cross-plot to identify performance drivers. In this case, I've plotted our EUR versus drainage area, and we see a very strong correlation. The EUR is very strongly related to our drainage area. Well, in this case, we have a 50-year forecast, so that kind of makes sense. Also, our reservoir permeability was in the microdarcy range. So with high-ish perms and a 50-year forecast, it's not surprising that the drainage area is dominating. If this was maybe a 10 or 20-year forecast, or per se we were in nanodarcy perm, I would expect some of the fracture parameters to have more of an influence on the EUR. So this concludes the Bakken field example, and now we're going to apply the approach to a more conventional reservoir. As I've mentioned before, this approach is not constrained to only unconventionals. It can be applied to any system. And so the next example will be in the Kharir basement in Yemen. And here's a look at where that is. So this reservoir is a hydrocarbon-bearing fractured granitic gneiss formation. This reservoir relies heavily on production through natural fractures. The well is drilled vertically, and it is not fractured. The test conditions for this example, our forecasting period was 20 years. Abandonment rate again was 5 barrels per day. 500 Monte Carlo runs were simulated. And once again, unless otherwise known, all distributions were either triangular or uniform. And the permeability and skin were estimated through regression. Here's a look at the vertical analytical model, a lot simpler than our multi-fractured model. We just have a vertical well in a rectangular reservoir. So I went ahead and history matched this well, and as you can see here, we have a pretty good history match. But once again, this is only one possible description. In this particular case, the well is actually not situated right in the middle of this rectangular reservoir, but it is closer to a couple boundaries on the left and at the bottom. When I generate the 20-year forecast, here is one possible outcome. We have about 12 million barrels. So once again, to generate a range of potential outcomes, I'm going to assign distributions to some uncertain parameters. This is what our input grid looks like, and I'm not going to go through each parameter one by one again. The procedure is very similar. We assign uncertainty to some of the parameters, and then some of them are listed as APE, which stands for Automatic Parameter Estimation, which is how we are controlling this regression analysis. So while the skin and the permeability are being recalculated each run, these other parameters, our net pay, our porosity, our oil saturation, the volume of our reservoir, they are being randomly sampled. once we run the simulation, just like before, we have our simulation results. We have ranges for our forecasts. We now understand the goalposts of our ultimate recoverable oil are between 11.7 million and about 14.6 million. So while 12.3 was a pretty good first guess, we now have a distribution of potential ultimate recoverables. To summarize, a probabilistic approach to RTA has been presented. This approach provides true P90, P50, P10 defensible forecasts. This approach is systematic and repeatable. It accounts for both uncertainty and the non-uniqueness of analytical models. The established production trend is honored throughout this process, and it is applicable to all types of reservoirs. I illustrated 2 examples here, but this can be applied to any reservoir description. Thank you for your time today, and do we have any questions? A few questions have been submitted online. I will choose 3 of them and go through them here. How do you choose between log normal, uniform, triangular, all the available distribution types? That's a very good question, and it's not one that I necessarily have the right answer to, but I will answer from my experience. As you may have noticed during my examples, I prefer to use the triangular and uniform distributions. I don't like to pretend that I know more than I do. If I have enough data available to me to fit distributions to some historical data, that would be the best way to go in my opinion. If not, I like to keep it simple with uniform and triangular distributions, as they require the fewest numbers of inputs. If I simply have a minimum and a maximum and no idea about anything else, I will likely choose a uniform, as that describes my knowledge of that parameter. If I have a minimum, a maximum, and a best guess, then I'll use a triangular. I will only use log normal and normal if I have some sort of confidence in doing so, some sort of data to support it. That being said, that's just me. Choosing these distribution types is very much up to the engineer. I will advocate that choosing the low side and the high side of distributions is much more important than the distribution type itself. So where you decide that your minimum and maximum are will have a much more significant impact on the results than choosing between a triangular and a log normal. The next question is, in what situations would you use correlations between your input parameters? I'll describe one example where I find it's very beneficial to include these correlations. In an unconventional multi-fractured well, I would recommend specifying a correlation between your number of fractures and your fracture half-length. This correlation would be negative. The reason for this is we don't want one of our realizations having a large number of fractures and a super large fracture half-length, when the next realization has very few number of fractures and a very short fracture half-length. The same amount of proppant and fluid was pumped for a given well, so we would expect a somewhat consistent contacted volume between all of our realizations. So by specifying that correlation, that can help maintain that consistency. So we have time for one more question. And that last one will be, how can I narrow down the range of my distributions? So the approach I've presented is a way to quantify the uncertainty, but this is a good question. How can we reduce that uncertainty? The easiest answer for me to say would be go and get the data. Go and get the microseismic, the tracer information, etc. However, that's a lot easier said than done. In the absence of that data, it is very difficult to reduce this uncertainty. One approach we've been looking at is combining PTA and RTA. Using pressure transient analysis to look at defit data and to perform buildup analyses can help us increase our confidence in some of these fracture parameters, which ultimately reduces our uncertainty. There's another webinar from one of my colleagues, Marty Santos, on integrating defit, buildup, microseismic results to enhance production analysis, along with a case study in the Horn River. I would recommend checking out this webinar as a means of reducing uncertainty in our production analysis. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.